In 1995, a 36-year-old man in Amsterdam lost his wife and was left alone with 4 children and no plan. What he built out of that grief, through cold water and controlled breathing and an obsessive willingness to test himself against things that should have broken him, eventually ended up in a peer-reviewed scientific journal and changed what researchers thought was possible inside the human body. This is the story of Wim Hof, not the brand, not the method. The man and the specific chain of desperate decisions that led him to accidentally prove something extraordinary. Stay until the end because the scientific finding is the part that reframes everything. Wim Hof had already discovered cold water before his wife died, the canals of Amsterdam in winter. He described it later as the one place where his mind went completely quiet, no noise, no anxiety, just the cold and the immediate requirement to breathe through it and stay present. He wasn't training, he wasn't running an experiment. He was a man who had found one thing that made the static stop. In 1995, his wife Elia died by suicide. She had struggled with serious mental illness for years. Wim was 36, he had 4 children to raise. He had no financial safety net and no clear path forward, and a grief that he later described as something with physical weight. He went back to the cold, not as a hobby, not as a wellness practice, as the only thing available to him that worked. He went into the canals and stayed longer. He started paying close attention to his breathing, specifically to what happened when he deliberately flooded his body with oxygen before going in. The protocol he developed was systematic, a pattern of controlled hyperventilation followed by extended breath retention. What he noticed was unexpected. His heart rate steadied in conditions that should have spiked it. His core temperature held in conditions that should have dropped it. His pain threshold shifted. The breathing wasn't just calming him down. It was doing something measurable to his physiology. He kept notes. What he was observing, without the vocabulary to name it yet, was voluntary activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response the body normally triggers automatically in response to threat. The controlled hyperventilation shifts blood chemistry, lowering carbon dioxide levels in ways that produce a specific cascade, increased adrenaline, altered pain perception, a physiological sharpness that's distinct from anxiety but similar in mechanism. He had stumbled onto a method for consciously triggering the same neurological state the body produces under genuine threat, and then learning to function inside it rather than be overwhelmed by it. For the next several years, he tested everything on himself, every single day, while raising 4 children in near poverty in Amsterdam. There was no lab, no funding, no collaboration. Just Wim Hof and the cold and a growing record of observations about what his nervous system was doing under conditions most people never experience voluntarily. He was also raising 4 children largely alone, working manual jobs to cover costs, and maintaining the daily cold practice regardless of how exhausted he was. The discipline the method required wasn't built from athletic ambition, it was built from necessity. Cold in the canal before dawn because if he didn't do it, the rest of the day didn't work. The method came out of that pressure, not out of optimization, but out of survival. Then those observations turned into records. He climbed to 24,000 feet on Mount Everest in nothing but shorts and shoes. He ran a half marathon above the Arctic Circle barefoot, on ice and snow. He stood submerged in ice for 1 hour and 52 minutes. He completed a full marathon through the Namib Desert with 0 water intake. He broke 26 world records in conditions that exercise physiologists had described as physiologically intolerable for an unprotected human body. Each record came with the same response from the scientific establishment. He was an outlier, an anomaly. His physiology was different. His results weren't reproducible in ordinary people and therefore didn't generalize. The interesting thing about this response is that it was scientifically responsible. Extraordinary individual results don't automatically mean anything about the population. A statistical outlier tells you nothing about what's generally possible. This was the scientific community doing its job correctly. It just happened to be wrong. he reached out to researchers himself. When they studied him, they confirmed that his core body temperature remained stable during prolonged ice submersion in ways that didn't match established models, and that his ability to voluntarily influence his autonomic nervous system responses tested well outside the normal human range. The autonomic nervous system runs your heart rate, your immune response, your digestion. It was considered involuntary by definition. You couldn't consciously control it, the way you can't decide to stop digesting food. Hof's results suggested otherwise, but the scientists still called him an outlier. So he made them an offer: give him for days and 12 ordinary volunteers, and he'd teach them what he did. The study design was elegant in its bluntness. Take 12 people with no prior experience in cold exposure or breath work, give Hof for days with them, then inject all 12, alongside an untrained control group, with a bacterial endotoxin derived from E. coli. The substance reliably produces fever, headache, nausea, and chills. In 100% of subjects, the immune system's response to the toxin was considered involuntary and unavoidable. That was the established clinical baseline. The control group responded exactly as the clinical data predicted. The group trained by Hof reported almost none of those symptoms. Their measured levels of inflammatory proteins, the markers the immune system produces in response to the toxin, were significantly lower than the control group. They had voluntarily modulated an immune response. The part of the nervous system that runs your heartbeat and your immune system had been deliberately influenced through breathing technique and cold exposure training that took for days to learn. The study appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2014. It held up to scrutiny. Researchers who had spent careers working on the outer limits of voluntary nervous system control had to redraw where they placed that boundary. Follow-up research has since explored applications in inflammatory conditions, autoimmune disease, and performance training. None of it was on Hof's agenda when he was standing in a canal in Amsterdam in the mid-1990s trying to outrun grief. He found it because he needed it, not because he was searching for it. Wim Hof did not set out to prove anything to science. He set out to survive. The cold was a lifeline before it became a method. The breathing protocol was a coping mechanism before it was a curriculum. He was not building a system. He was doing the only thing that kept the grief from pulling him under, every day, for years, until the grief became something he had learned to carry rather than something that was carrying him. If Wim Hof's story hit you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs a reminder of what people are genuinely capable of.